Picture this. You're sitting in a meeting and a colleague dismisses your idea with a condescending smirk. Your stomach tightens. Your face flushes. In that moment, something ancient and primal has just occurred. A psychological battle that most people don't even realize they're fighting. This isn't just about rudeness or bad manners. What you've just experienced is a form of psychological warfare, as deliberate and calculated as any military strategy. And here's the unsettling truth. Most of us are losing this war every single day. In 1951, a young psychologist named Solomon Asch conducted an experiment that would forever change how we understand human behavior. He gathered groups of people and asked them to identify which of 3 lines matched the length of a reference line. The answer was obvious, until Asch planted actors in the room who deliberately gave wrong answers. What happened next was disturbing. 1/3 of the real participants abandoned their own clear perception and conformed to the obviously incorrect group response. But here's what Asch didn't emphasize in his published findings. There were always a few subjects who remained completely unshakable. No matter how much social pressure was applied, no matter how isolated they became, they held their ground. They seemed to possess an invisible armor against psychological manipulation. These individuals had discovered something that most of humanity struggles with, the art of commanding respect without aggression, without pleading, without compromising their authentic selves. They understood that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you architect through precise psychological principles. Disrespect isn't random. It's a probe, a test of your psychological boundaries. When someone disrespects you, they're essentially asking, how much can I get away with? How far can I push before you push back? And most importantly, do you even know your own worth? The consequences of failing this test extend far beyond hurt feelings. Chronic disrespect literally rewires your brain, diminishing your sense of self-worth, your decision-making ability, and your capacity to pursue your goals. It's a slow-acting poison that seeps into every area of your life. But what if I told you that there are 5 psychological principles, ancient in their wisdom, modern in their application, that can make you virtually immune to disrespect? What if the very people who once dismissed you could be transformed into reluctant admirers of your unshakable presence? The path forward isn't what you think. It doesn't involve becoming more aggressive, more confrontational, or more defensive. Instead, it requires understanding something far more sophisticated about human nature itself. But first, we need to understand why some people seem immune to disrespect while others crumble. And it all starts with a discovery made in the 1940s that changed everything we thought we knew about human nature. The discovery I'm referring to emerged from some of the most controversial psychological experiments in history. Stanford Prison Experiment, Milgram's obedience studies. These weren't just academic exercises. They were windows into the darkest aspects of human social behavior. What these experiments revealed was chilling. Within hours, sometimes minutes, humans automatically establish dominance hierarchies. We can't help it. It's hardwired into our neural architecture, a survival mechanism inherited from our prehistoric ancestors, who lived in small tribes where social status determined access to resources, mates, and ultimately survival itself. But here's where it gets interesting. In every one of these experiments, researchers noticed the same phenomenon that Asch had observed. There were always outliers. Individuals who seemed immune to the social pressures that crushed everyone else. Guards who refused to abuse prisoners. Subjects who wouldn't deliver electric shocks regardless of authority pressure. People who maintained their psychological center even when the entire social structure around them collapsed into chaos. What made them different wasn't superior morality or stronger willpower. It was something far more subtle. They understood that respect is fundamentally about psychological territory. When someone disrespects you, they're not just being rude. They're engaging in an ancient ritual of territorial expansion. Like animals marking their domain, they're attempting to establish psychological dominance by diminishing your sense of self-worth. It's an unconscious process, driven by primitive brain circuits that most people don't even know they possess. Think about it. Why do people become disrespectful? It's rarely random. Disrespect typically emerges when someone perceives you as occupying psychological space they want to claim for themselves. Maybe it's social status, professional recognition, or simply the attention of others. Your very existence in that space triggers their territorial instincts. This is why traditional advice about standing up for yourself often backfires spectacularly. When you respond to disrespect with aggression or defensiveness, you're playing by their rules, fighting on their chosen battlefield. You've already lost because you've accepted their frame that this is a contest of dominance. Modern society has amplified this problem exponentially. Traditional hierarchies that once provided a clear social structure have collapsed. We live in a world where everyone thinks they deserve respect, but no one agrees on the criteria for earning it. Social media has created an artificial scarcity of attention and validation, turning every interaction into a potential battleground for psychological resources. The result? An epidemic of disrespect masquerading as authenticity, confidence, or keeping it real. People have become psychological predators, unconsciously seeking opportunities to elevate themselves by diminishing others. But here's what most people don't realize: their responses to disrespect actually reinforce it. Getting angry proves you can be manipulated. Defending yourself suggests there's something to defend against. Explaining your worth implies it needs explanation. Every emotional reaction feeds the disrespectful person's unconscious need for psychological dominance. This creates a vicious cycle. The more you react, the more disrespect you invite. The more disrespect you experience, the more your self-worth erodes. The more your self-worth erodes, the more vulnerable you become to future attacks. It's a downward spiral that can destroy even the strongest individuals. But here's what the researchers didn't publish in their official findings. There were always a few subjects who seemed completely immune to these psychological attacks. They possessed something that made them untouchable, unshakable, almost mysterious in their self-containment. What made them different wasn't what they did. It was what they didn't do. And that brings us to the first psychological trick that can transform you from a victim to someone who commands natural respect. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor of Rome, once wrote in his private journal, "How much trouble he avoids who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does, but only to what he does himself." This wasn't just philosophical musing, it was a survival strategy for maintaining psychological sovereignty in the most politically dangerous environment in human history. Aurelius understood something that modern neuroscience has now confirmed. The less you react to disrespect, the more psychological power you actually gain. This seems counterintuitive, even impossible. How can doing nothing make you stronger? The answer lies in understanding what disrespectful people are really seeking: your emotional energy. Every eye roll, every defensive explanation, every angry response feeds a primitive reward system in their brain. When you react emotionally to disrespect, you're literally providing the neurochemical payoff that reinforces their behavior. Think of disrespectful people as psychological vampires. They feed on emotional reactions because it confirms their ability to affect you, to penetrate your psychological defenses, to matter in your internal world. Your anger, hurt, or frustration becomes proof of their power over you. Indifference starves them of this neurochemical reward. When you remain genuinely unmoved by their attempts to provoke you, something fascinating happens in their brain. The behavior that previously gave them a dopamine hit suddenly provides nothing. Like a slot machine that stops paying out, they lose interest and move on to easier targets. But true indifference isn't what most people think it is. It's not cold dismissal or obvious contempt. Those are still emotional reactions. Real indifference is a state of complete psychological detachment, where their behavior simply doesn't register as significant enough to warrant an internal response. This is where the grey rock method becomes powerful. Named after the way unremarkable rocks blend into the landscape, this technique involves making yourself so emotionally uninteresting that disrespectful people naturally lose interest. You become boring to them because you provide no emotional feedback to sustain their psychological predation. The key is reframing disrespect as valuable information rather than a personal attack. When someone is disrespectful, they're revealing something crucial about their character, their insecurities, their level of emotional development. You're gathering intelligence about who they really are beneath their social mask. This reframe is psychologically liberating because it transforms you from victim to observer. Instead of being hurt by their behavior, you become curious about it. What drove them to act this way? What insecurity are they trying to mask? What does their choice to disrespect you reveal about their relationship with themselves? But here's the critical distinction. Indifference is not passivity. Passivity suggests you're absorbing their disrespect, but choosing not to respond. True indifference means their disrespect literally bounces off your psychological armor without leaving a mark. This requires developing what psychologists call emotional granularity, the ability to observe your emotional responses without being consumed by them. You notice the initial flash of irritation or hurt, but you don't identify with it. It's just information about your nervous system's automatic response patterns, not a truth about your worth or their power over you. The paradox deepens when you realize that indifference often triggers respect. People are unconsciously drawn to those who seem unaffected by social pressures, who possess an inner stability that external circumstances can't shake. Your indifference becomes a form of quiet strength that others find both mysterious and admirable. But there's a dark side to indifference that most people don't see coming. Pure indifference taken too far can make you seem inhuman, disconnected, or sociopathic. It can isolate you from genuine human connection and make others perceive you as cold or calculating. This is why indifference alone isn't enough. It needs to be balanced with something else, something that maintains your humanity while protecting your psychological territory. And that leads us to the second trick, which involves something psychologists call strategic vulnerability. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy faced the most dangerous moment of his presidency, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nuclear war seemed inevitable, yet Kennedy's response wasn't to appear stronger or more aggressive. Instead, he did something that seemed weak at the time but proved psychologically brilliant. He publicly acknowledged his own uncertainty and the limitations of American intelligence. This apparent vulnerability disarmed Soviet aggression more effectively than any show of force could have. By admitting what everyone already suspected, that he didn't have perfect information, Kennedy forced the Soviets to recalibrate their entire strategy. They had prepared to exploit his defensive reactions, not his honest acknowledgement of uncertainty. This is the essence of strategic vulnerability, selectively revealing controlled aspects of your humanity in ways that actually increase your psychological power. It seems paradoxical, but admitting specific limitations often makes you appear more confident, not less. Here's why this works on a neurological level. Humans are evolutionarily wired to attack perceived strength because it represents competition for resources. But we're also wired to feel uncomfortable attacking admitted vulnerability because it triggers our protective instincts rather than our competitive ones. When someone is being disrespectful, they've unconsciously identified you as a threat that needs to be diminished. Strategic vulnerability disrupts this perception by reframing the interaction. Instead of a competitor to be defeated, you become a human being worthy of basic consideration. The technique requires surgical precision. You're not admitting weakness or inferiority. You're acknowledging specific selected aspects of your humanity that actually demonstrate strength. For instance, saying, "I don't know everything about this topic, but here's what I do know," shows intellectual confidence, not ignorance. Controlled self-deprecation works similarly. When you make a mild joke about your own flaws before others can point them out, you steal their psychological ammunition, while demonstrating that you're secure enough to acknowledge imperfection. This makes you seem more authentic and harder to attack. Strategic transparency operates on the same principle. By selectively revealing your thought process, motivations, or concerns, you create psychological intimacy that makes disrespect feel inappropriate. People find it harder to be cruel to someone whose inner world they partially understand. The art of intellectual humility takes this further. When you say things like, "I might be wrong about this," or "help me understand your perspective," you're not showing weakness, you're demonstrating the ultimate confidence, the security to learn and grow regardless of what others think. But this technique walks a knife's edge. The difference between strategic vulnerability and actual weakness is intention and control. Strategic vulnerability is deliberate, selective, and serves your psychological interests. Actual weakness is unconscious, comprehensive, and invites further exploitation. The key is maintaining what psychologists call vulnerable strength, the paradoxical combination of openness and boundaries, humanity and self-respect. You're accessible enough to connect with, but centered enough to command respect. This technique often catches disrespectful people off guard because they've prepared for defensiveness or aggression, not authentic humanity. Your strategic vulnerability forces them to relate to you as a complete person rather than a target, which naturally elevates the interaction above the level of psychological combat. But vulnerability alone isn't enough. There's a third element that separates those who command respect from those who get trampled, and it's hiding in plain sight in every interaction you have. Winston Churchill once said, "You have enemies. Good. That means you've stood up for something, sometime in your life." But Churchill understood something about boundaries that most people miss. The goal isn't to create enemies, it's to create clarity about where you end and others begin. The boundary paradox is this. Most people set boundaries in ways that actually invite more disrespect. They either set them too aggressively, creating unnecessary conflict, or too weakly, sending the message that their psychological territory is available for invasion. Consider how most people respond to disrespect. They either explode in anger, creating drama that others want to avoid, or they silently absorb it, teaching the disrespectful person that such behavior is acceptable. Both responses communicate psychological instability, either reactive volatility or passive acceptance of poor treatment. Effective boundary setting triggers what neuroscientists call the respect response in the human brain. When you calmly, clearly and consistently communicate your limits without emotion or aggression, something fascinating happens. The other person's brain automatically categorizes you as someone who respects themselves and therefore deserves respect from others. The broken record technique demonstrates this perfectly. When someone crosses a boundary, you simply repeat your position in the same calm tone, regardless of their escalation. I've already explained my position on this. As I mentioned, that doesn't work for me. Like I said, I won't be available for that. This consistency is psychologically powerful because it demonstrates that your boundaries aren't emotional reactions. They're stable features of your personality. The disrespectful person quickly learns that testing your boundaries produces the same result every time. Polite, unmovable resistance. Consequence: escalation takes this further. You begin with the gentlest possible boundary enforcement and gradually increase the consequences if the behavior continues. This isn't punishment, it's natural cause and effect. If you continue interrupting me, I'll need to end this conversation. Then you follow through without anger or explanation. The art of non-emotional enforcement is crucial here. The moment you become emotional about enforcing a boundary, you've turned it into a power struggle. But when your enforcement is calm, matter-of-fact and inevitable, it becomes simply a natural consequence of their choices. This is why disrespectful people often unconsciously test boundaries. They're trying to determine if you'll protect your own psychological space. It's not usually malicious. It's an automatic social calibration process. They need to know where they stand with you, what they can expect, and how you'll respond to pressure. Your response to these tests literally programs their future behavior toward you. Inconsistent boundary enforcement teaches them that your boundaries are negotiable, emotional, and subject to pressure. Consistent enforcement teaches them that your boundaries are facts of nature, as predictable and unmovable as gravity. Many people fear that setting boundaries will create conflict, but the opposite is usually true. Clear boundaries actually reduce conflict because they eliminate the ambiguity that leads to misunderstandings and power struggles. When people know exactly what to expect from you, interactions become more relaxed and respectful. The paradox is that strong boundaries often make you more approachable, not less. When people know you'll protect yourself, they don't have to worry about accidentally hurting you or walking on eggshells around your sensitivity. They can relax and interact with you more authentically. But here's what most boundary-setting advice misses. Boundaries alone create respect, but they don't necessarily create influence. You can have perfect boundaries and still find yourself marginalized, ignored, or bypassed entirely. Even the strongest boundaries crumble without the fourth trick, something intelligence agencies have used for decades to break down even the most psychologically hardened individuals. In 1983, KGB defector Yuri Bezmenov revealed something chilling about Soviet psychological warfare. The most effective way to destroy a society is not through military force or economic pressure, but by controlling the flow of information. When you control what people know, you control how they think. And when you control how they think, you control who they become. This principle doesn't just apply to nations, it applies to every human interaction. The person who controls information flow controls the psychological dynamics of the relationship. And most people are unconsciously hemorrhaging information that disrespectful individuals use against them. Think about how social media has created an information vulnerability crisis. People broadcast their insecurities, their schedules, their relationships, their political views, their emotional states. They provide a complete psychological profile that manipulative people can exploit to find pressure points, predict reactions, and craft more effective disrespect. Disrespectful people are often skilled at gathering intelligence about you while revealing nothing meaningful about themselves. They ask probing questions, make assumptions, and study your reactions to build a psychological map of your vulnerabilities. Then they use this information to calibrate their attacks for maximum impact. Reversing this dynamic gives you a tremendous psychological advantage. When you control what others know about you, you control how they perceive you, how they interact with you, and ultimately, how much respect they feel compelled to show you. Strategic mystery is the first technique. Instead of oversharing, you become selectively transparent. You reveal enough to seem authentic and relatable, but never enough to seem completely predictable or understood. This creates what psychologists call curiosity loops in other people's minds. They become unconsciously interested in learning more about you. Controlled revelation takes this further. You're parceling out information about yourself strategically, making people work for deeper knowledge. This isn't manipulation, it's natural human psychology. We value what costs us effort to obtain. When someone has to gather information about you, they automatically assign more value to both the information and to you as a person. The art of making people work for information about you transforms the psychological dynamic. Instead of you trying to prove your worth to them, they find themselves trying to prove their worth to you. This subtle shift changes everything about how the interaction unfolds. Consider how this applies to disrespectful behavior. When someone doesn't fully understand you, your motivations, your capabilities, your background, they can't easily predict your responses or find effective ways to diminish you. Your mystery becomes a form of psychological armor that makes their usual tactics ineffective. Social media mastery involves reversing the typical pattern. Instead of broadcasting your life, you curate your presence. You share content that demonstrates value without revealing vulnerability. You engage strategically rather than reactively. You make your online presence an asset rather than a liability. This connects directly to respect, because humans have an evolutionary bias toward respecting what they don't fully understand or control. Mystery suggests depth, complexity, and hidden resources. It implies that you might be more capable, more connected, or more significant than you initially appear. The psychology of curiosity works in your favor here. When people can't easily categorize you or predict your responses, their brains automatically assign you a higher status. Uncertainty about your capabilities tends to be resolved in your favor, not against you. This is why historical figures who mastered information control, from Churchill's strategic ambiguity to Steve Jobs' obsessive secrecy, commanded such respect even from their enemies. They understood that being understandable makes you vulnerable, while being somewhat mysterious makes you formidable. But information control isn't about being secretive or manipulative. It's about being intentional with your transparency, strategic with your revelations, and protective of your psychological privacy. You're not hiding who you are. You're controlling how and when people discover who you are. The goal is to create an information asymmetry where you understand others better than they understand you. This doesn't mean gathering compromising information or being deceptive. It means being more observant, more strategic, and more protective of your psychological territory than the average person. But there's one final trick that ties all of these together, something so counterintuitive that it reverses everything you think you know about handling disrespect. In traditional martial arts, there's a fundamental difference between hard and soft power. Hard power meets force with force. When someone pushes you, you push back harder. Soft power uses the attacker's energy against them. When someone pushes you, you step aside and redirect their momentum so they fall forward into space. Aikido master Morihei Ueshiba once demonstrated this principle before a group of skeptical military officers. He stood calmly as each officer charged at him with full force. Without apparent effort, he would step slightly to one side, guide their momentum with minimal contact, and watch as they tumbled past him, off balance and confused. He wasn't overpowering them. He was using their own aggressive energy to defeat them. This same principle can transform how you handle psychological aggression. Instead of meeting disrespect with defensive energy or counterattack, you learn to redirect that disrespectful energy in ways that serve your purposes while leaving the aggressor psychologically off balance. Verbal Aikido works by accepting the surface content of disrespectful comments while redirecting their emotional intent. When someone says, "You don't know what you're talking about," instead of defending your knowledge, you might respond, "You're right that I don't know everything about this. What would you add to help me understand better?" You've acknowledged their statement while redirecting the energy toward productive dialogue. This response is psychologically disarming because it doesn't give them the resistance they expected. They prepared for you to defend yourself, which would have allowed them to attack further. Instead, you've transformed their criticism into a request for their expertise, which appeals to their ego while maintaining your dignity. Emotional redirection operates similarly. When someone tries to make you angry, you redirect that energy into curiosity about their motivation. When someone tries to make you defensive, you redirect it into appreciation for their concern. When someone tries to diminish you, you redirect it into an opportunity to demonstrate grace under pressure. The key insight is that disrespectful energy is still energy, and energy can be transformed rather than absorbed or reflected. When you absorb it, you get hurt. When you reflect on it, you create conflict. But when you transform it, you can actually use it to improve your position. This transformation requires all 4 previous tricks working in harmony. Your indifference keeps you from getting emotionally hijacked. Your strategic vulnerability makes you seem human rather than defensive. Your boundaries prevent the energy from overwhelming you. Your information control ensures you're not giving them ammunition for future attacks. Together, these create a psychological Aikido that turns their disrespectful energy into respect for your unshakable composure. They came to diminish you, but their own energy, redirected through your skillful response, ends up elevating your status in the interaction. Consider how this might work in practice. Someone publicly criticizes your idea in a meeting. Instead of defending the idea or attacking their competence, you might say, "That's an interesting perspective. I'm curious about the assumptions behind your concern. Help me understand what you think would work better." You've redirected their critical energy into a collaborative exploration that makes them look constructive rather than destructive. This approach doesn't just neutralize disrespect. It transforms it into an opportunity to demonstrate your psychological sophistication. Observers notice that you can handle aggression with grace, that you can maintain your center under pressure, that you can turn conflict into collaboration. The ultimate goal isn't just to stop disrespect, but to transform disrespectful people into reluctant admirers of your psychological mastery. They may not like you, but they'll respect your ability to handle their aggression without becoming aggressive yourself. This is the highest level of psychological self-defense, not just protecting yourself from others' negative energy, but actually using that energy to elevate yourself and potentially transform the aggressor. It's the difference between surviving psychological warfare and transcending it entirely. We began this journey by acknowledging an uncomfortable truth. Respect is a battleground, and most people are losing a war they don't even know they're fighting. But now you possess something that changes everything. The knowledge that psychological sovereignty isn't about becoming harder, colder, or more aggressive. It's about becoming more skillful. These 5 principles, strategic indifference, controlled vulnerability, paradoxical boundaries, information mastery, and psychological Aikido, aren't just techniques for handling disrespect. They're tools for reclaiming your psychological territory in a world designed to fragment your attention, erode your confidence, and reduce you to a collection of predictable reactions. Every day, you're bombarded with attempts to manipulate your emotions, harvest your data, predict your behavior, and influence your decisions. Social algorithms study your psychological patterns. Marketing systems exploit your insecurities. Political messaging triggers your tribal reflexes. Even well-meaning people unconsciously test your boundaries, probe your vulnerabilities, and compete for your psychological resources. In this environment, the person who maintains psychological center isn't just protecting themselves. They're engaging in a quiet revolution against the forces that seek to control human consciousness itself. You're refusing to be reduced to your reactions. You're declining to participate in the psychological circus that consumes most people's mental energy. This revolution doesn't require protests, manifestos, or public declarations. It happens in the space between stimulus and response, in your choice to observe rather than react, in your decision to respond strategically rather than emotionally. It's a revolution of consciousness, disguised as ordinary social interaction. The person who has mastered these principles becomes something rare in our current world, psychologically sovereign. They can't be easily manipulated, predicted, or controlled. They respond from choice rather than compulsion. They engage with the world from a position of strength rather than reactive vulnerability. But perhaps most importantly, they inspire others through their example. When people encounter someone who can't be rattled, who responds to aggression with grace, who maintains their center regardless of external pressure, it reminds them that such psychological mastery is possible. Your unshakable presence becomes proof that there's an alternative to the anxious reactivity that characterizes modern life. This is how individual transformation becomes social. Transformation, not through changing others directly, but through becoming someone who demonstrates a different way of being. Your psychological sovereignty permits others to reclaim their own. The choice before you is simple but profound. Will you continue to be a victim of others' psychological games, allowing their disrespect to erode your sense of self? Or will you become someone who commands natural respect through understanding the deeper patterns of human nature? The invisible war for your psychological territory never ends. But now you know it's being fought. You understand the weapons being used against you, and most importantly, you possess the skills to not just survive this war, but to transform it into an opportunity for psychological mastery. The quiet revolution begins with you, and it begins now.